for joining us today. Um, we've got a lot of material to cover and want to make sure that we address questions that you have, but we found that it works a little bit better if you post questions and then we come back to them at the end, because often many can be combined. So please feel free to post your questions and we'll do our best to leave at least 20 and hopefully 30 minutes at the end to be answering them. Our agenda today is to talk about what retail is, what mixed use is. We're going to go through a little bit of a Retail 101 primer, talking about how retail works. And then we're going to dive into mixed use best practices. Finally, we'll do a case study, a will it work case study. And then at the end, normally I talk a little bit about public sector, private sector intersections. In this particular case, we're going to go slightly different direction and talk about retail resilience, because it really has a, I think, near and dear place to everybody, given what's going on with the coronavirus epidemic. So starting off with retail, we're going to define retail as, the sale of goods to the public in small quantities and more to the point, for use as consumption rather than resale. And of all of the various land uses, retail is really the most sensitive to location and facility. And so, location intelligence by necessity needs to be both subjective and objective in evaluation. And, we want to talk about why retailers care about one location or not, because often a different quadrant of the same intersection makes a material difference. So who wants retail? There are a lot of different stakeholders. Communities, it's important to communities. It's important to residents and consumers, important to retailers, of course, and then finally, important to property owners who are developing and leasing space to retailers. I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about how retail organizes itself in today's world. You all probably have one of these, or more likely a newer model, and you're really agnostic about where you get it. And the reason for that is that it's a commodity. It's exactly the same thing no matter where you buy it. So your primary motivation is a trade-off between price and convenience. Your purchasing function is informed by how immediately you need it versus how price sensitive you are on its purchase. So whether it's a phone or whether it's a ream of copy paper, they're all commodities. They're all the same no matter where you get them. Now, that differs in many ways from other kinds of goods and services. And we call these specialty retail uses. And the difference here is that you purchase specialty goods using your discretionary income, so income that's not earmarked to pay the mortgage or tuition or shoes for the kids. And you spend it during your discretionary time, so the time that you're not spending at work or taking care of the exigencies of life. So for this reason, experience and a sense of place becomes very important. And we tend to have a more emotional connection to these kinds of purchases, whether that's clothing, and it's how we're projecting ourselves to the world. This is how I like to look. This is how I like to present myself. Or whether, perhaps it's a nice dinner out with a partner to get away from to everyday life for a little bit of time. So in terms of creating a sense of space, I want you to also think about active space. And this is space where pedestrians interact with the built environment. They don't necessarily have to enter a store, but you're interacting with it because of transparency, because it spills out onto the sidewalk. And this differs from non-active space, where the flow of the retail district is broken and pedestrians don't interact. And this is going to be particularly pertinent as we talk about different types of mixed-use projects, because often there is a struggle to balance active versus non-active space in the design, particularly of the podium level. I want to talk very briefly about retail channels. There, of course, are many, many retail channels. You know, back when I was a kid, you know, there was a catalog, like a Sears catalog or a Service Merchandise catalog, and there were stores. And there were some subscriptions. There probably are a few of you out there who might have had a subscription to the Columbia Record and Tape Club. But in today's world, there are many, many more. And of course, there are still subscriptions. They're much more sophisticated than they were many years ago. But in terms of retail, we talk about omni-channel retail, and I want to make a distinction between omni-channel retail and multi-channel retail. Purchasing goods and services through a variety of channels is multi-channel retail, multiple channels. The consistency of experience across those multiple channels is what we call omni-channel retailing. So as that comes up, I wanted to take this opportunity to draw that distinction. And it does make a difference in terms of how you're thinking about the tenants that you might be putting into projects. I want to now shift gears to the design of mixed-use space. And first, let's define mixed use. And we're going to define it as a combination of uses in the same project. And this mixed-use project can be a single building, it can be a city block, or it can be an entire neighborhood. And regardless of scale, the principles that we're going to be talking about here will apply. There are different designs for mixed use. There's a vertically integrated mixed use where you have one use on top of another. And then there's horizontally integrated mixed use where you have different uses that are adjacent to each other. And there are much different implications designing each. And you know, here you can see them side by side. You know, an area with very expensive or scarce land may merit a vertical solution, whereas an area that has ample land may be better suited for a horizontal solution. I also want to take this opportunity to separate what I'm going to call real estate attributes, so attributes about the location, versus facility attributes, attributes about the building. And we're going to dig in first by talking a little bit about real estate attributes. And I love putting this slide up because in addition to this kid's exuberance about being at the market, it makes the point that all of us have been retail consumers literally from the time that our parents put us in a shopping cart and started wheeling us down the aisle, and we were trying to grab Tony the Tiger off the shelf. There's a reason that Tony the Tiger and Fruit Loops and Lucky Charms are at eye level for a kid sitting in a shopping cart. Take a look at that next time you go to the grocery store. So, in terms of big picture considerations, we look at demographics. It's often the first thing that everybody looks at, but I'm going to make the case that it's not the most important. We look at characteristics of existing retail. We're going to look at traffic patterns, which I think is extremely important. Going to look at spending by different retail categories, and then at other things that might end up being positive contributors to demand, such as conventions, hotel rooms, office space, tourism. And then finally, we're going to look at retailer-specific information. I spent many, many years building drugstores, and so I'm going to use pharmacies as an example because I've got some good data on that, and it's very easy to understand. But if you're looking to open a drugstore, you need people to work in the drugstore. So, you know, looking for local pharmacy schools is important, just as looking for prescribers of prescriptions is important. You want to put a pharmacy near where you have lots of doctors that are writing prescriptions. So, in terms of location, what you have in front of you is an aerial of the Coachella Valley in Southern California. Every single one of those boxes, whether it's yellow or red or blue, is a subdivision. And they're differentiated by color. So for example, a yellow box might be a subdivision where there is a tentative map approved, whereas a blue box might be a subdivision that's actually under construction. It's a very helpful tool in understanding what's happening with population, particularly in a growth area. Also on this map, you're finding grocery stores. And in the case of each grocery store, it's putting an assumed volume for the grocery store. We're going to get to projecting volumes a little bit later on in the presentation, but what this does is give you a good idea by looking at the aerial of where people already live and where they're going to be living in the future, and where the grocery stores are going to be located, and where they're presently located and where they're going to need to be located in order to serve future population. Now, along those same lines, you're going to have circulation planning. And in this particular case, every one of these lines represents a street that has a different traffic carrying capacity. So if you were to look at the streets that have the widest, biggest lines, those are the streets that are going to be carrying the most vehicles. And so long before there were ever any homes built in this area and offices and other amenities built in this area, this traffic plan was created and put in place. So by looking at it, you can see by where the major thoroughfares are being put in, where the people are going to be going, and by extension, where the highest traffic volumes actually are going to be existing. Now, retail wants traffic, and so that's the reason that this is a particularly important concept. So I'm continuing to move forward. We also can look at where existing retail is located, and one of the ways of doing that is to map retail employment. This is information that is mapped by a number of different private services and is also available through organizations like the Census Bureau. So in this particular case, the blue dots represents retail employment, and the red, the larger red dots, drugstores, and the larger green dots, grocery stores. So as we're looking about putting a grocery store here, we're able to see where they're located and where there may be holes in the market, and then where might there be a hole in an area that already has existing retail development going on. Driving things down to a little bit greater level of detail, we might map something and include additional information like traffic counts so that we can begin to see in a little bit more dynamic manner how people are moving about and what the gravity side or the gravity direction is. So in other words, when you're going from a lower traffic count to a higher traffic count on the same street, that the lower to the higher represents the gravity direction for traffic. The other thing that I think is very important about this map is how you communicate information. And this is going to be very important as you're talking with retailers. This map and this aerial are exactly the same, but with a different base layer. And I'm just going to toggle back and forth between these just a little bit. And you can see on the aerial that you have a much better idea about density of housing than you do from this map. And so as you're trying to communicate the benefits of locations to retailers, how you're communicating that information is extremely important. And the map is good for showing the traffic and bringing that to the forefront. But in terms of showing the density benefit, the aerial is better. Finally, retailers often have a huge amount of proprietary information at their fingertips. And one of those bits of information is knowing where you and I as customers live. Any of you who have ever swiped your club card at any store have probably given the retailer quite a bit of information, like your name, perhaps your phone number, your address. Even if you've only given part of the information, the retailer has the ability to, with some degree of accuracy, fill in the balance. And we store all that information and then can map it. So in this particular case, we have two retail stores, Store 1, the red store, and Store 2, the blue store, in this particular trade area. Now, the customers for Store 1 are shown as the red pin dots, and the customers for Store 2 as the blue pin dots. So when we're looking about whether or not we want to open a new store, where the blue label is with the arrow, we can begin to see, okay, do we already cover that area with stores that we already have? And in this case, the answer is yes. And we can see by the density of the pins, look at the density where it says new store site versus the density at Store 2, of just how much penetration there is in that particular area. So these are tools that more sophisticated retailers have available to them. And as we're opening stores, we're always being very careful not to cannibalize existing stores that we have. Now, this is kind of an interesting exercise. I had a client a number of years ago that manufactured very high-end rehab equipment that was made for people who had had orthopedic surgery, hip replacements, knee replacements, that sort of thing. And they sold to physical therapy clinics, rehab centers, hospitals, what have you, and they wanted to open some retail stores, direct to the consumer stores. So they knew that their customer base was old because older people have more orthopedic issues, people that need assistance regardless of age, but they also knew that this wasn't going to be covered by insurance, so they needed people that could afford to pay out of pocket for their services. So we were looking for places where we had old people, people that needed assistance, and people with high income. They also wanted to do this for a variety of reasons that's not important in Sydney, Australia. And I was very happy to fly to Sydney and do some original market research, but instead I convinced the client that they probably ought to be doing some market research from a distance. And so we did heat maps for each of these characteristics. And then we looked at where the greatest density of each characteristic overlapped. And so we were able to find, without ever getting onto an airplane, the areas in which they most likely would want to start opening stores, and we could begin to do research about availability. And we do this regardless. You know, every retailer has its customer base, and we're looking for where the primary attributes for the customer base overlap. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about trade areas. And some of you have probably been in the car and had a passenger or a child, or even thought yourself, you know, why would they put a Union 76 station right across the street from a Union 76 station? How stupid is that? So let's talk about that for just a minute. What did Union 76 know that isn't necessarily readily apparent? So in this particular stretch of 19th Avenue in San Francisco, there are no left turns literally for miles. So in order to make a left, you need to make 3 rights and go through a signal. So the thing's median bound, which means that the northbound traffic is a completely separate trade area from the southbound traffic with respect to customers of gas stations. So we need to think about trade areas dynamically. It's not a 3-mile ring necessarily, and this is part of the reason that I said that demographics are not necessarily my favorite thing to look at. I really like looking at traffic patterns, and I love staring at maps and looking at barriers. What are artificial barriers? What are natural barriers? How do people behave? And this gets back to the kid in the shopping cart. all of us have been shopping literally from the time our parents dragged us to the grocery store. And and because of that, we should not hesitate to use our own experience in understanding behavior. Why do we behave in a certain way? We're valid data points. Why do your friends and acquaintances and colleagues and strangers, why do they behave in the ways that they do? And these are legitimate takeaways that need to be balanced against our own personal bias. So there is an element of taking a step back outside of ourselves, observing our behaviors, understanding why we and others behave in the ways that we do. Let's begin to shift gears a little bit and along the continuum begin to move in the direction of talking about facility. So still staying within the real estate attribute silo, if you will, there are all kinds of different locations, whether it's a true corner, corner by access. Imagine a gas station with a shopping center behind the gas station on either side of the gas station. Gas station's got the hard corner. So that would be what I would call corner by access. And then there are different kinds of buildings, whether it's a mall or an office building or freestanding, in line in a shopping center is different than end cap in a shopping center. And then there's also what the building looks like, what condition it's in, how old is it? Is it a current size for the type of retail? Banks, for example, used to be in much larger facilities than they need to be in now. Does the building allow for a full or a limited operation? And then there are key site attributes. And no matter where you are, I think that these attributes are important. So whether we're building something in downtown Chicago, New York City, San Francisco, or whether we're building them in classically suburban areas like St. Louis or Salt Lake City or Phoenix, parking, visibility, and access are all important. So visibility, if you can't see it, you don't necessarily know it's there. And if you can see it, even if you can see it and you can't get to it, then it's going to be problematic. In terms of parking, if you're in a highly urban area, parking might be bicycle parking, okay? It might not be automobile parking, but unless your mode of transportation is strictly on foot, that's something that needs to be looked at. So parking, visibility, access, three mantras by which retailers live by, and these have particularly important implications for mixed-use projects. I also want to take just a second to talk about store design. And you may have heard a retailer talk about their prototype. Well, the prototype is designed by a retailer saying, okay, what do I want to sell? And how do I want to lay it out? What things best go by other things? So, for example, if you are in a grocery store, you're going to find that baby formula might be next to diapers, even though diapers you tend to associate with paper goods, and formula you might tend to associate with packaged goods. But that adjacency is designed and built in to try to get you to cross shop. So, so the retailer designs how they want to lay things out, what they want their merchandise mix to be, and then they draw 4 lines around it. That's the prototype store size. A prototype doesn't start with we want to build a 10,000 square foot store. It starts with, what do we want to sell that will maximize our sales in a way that will cause the shopper to shop most efficiently and frankly buy the most. And then whatever that size ends up being is the prototype. In this particular case, this is a drugstore with a drive-through pharmacy. On the lower right, you see the front door. The parking is on either side of the building, adjacent to that front door. But the drive-through pharmacy is catty corner in the building. There are a couple of reasons for that. One is, if you're going to a drugstore, we want you to walk all the way to the back of the store in order to get the thing that you came for, just like the dairy is in the back of the grocery store. And secondly, it's important for that drive-through pharmacy to be located in such a way that the driver's side window is to the building as people circulate through the parking lot. Finally, the loading dock where the trucks go are on the top of the building, top of the site plan that you've got laid out here. And part of the reason for that is we don't want trucks and cars having the same traffic pattern. Trucks and cars don't get along very well. And we're going to go into this in a little bit more detail. In the interest of time, I'm just going to use this as an example of, where we had a store. It was on an end cap, but we had all of the things that we're talking about here. You had great visibility from Beach Avenue and from this off-ramp. It was a right-hand turn in and out of the shopping center. This drugstore was on the end cap of a shopping center with a bunch of tenants that aren't daily needs tenants. So why would we put it there? And the answer is that we would have put it there even if the rest of the shopping center didn't exist, because we essentially had all of the attributes for which we were looking. Great visibility, easy access with right in, right out, the excellent parking adjacent to the front door, a drive-through pharmacy on the right-hand side of that hatched building that allowed for the driver's side to be adjacent to the pharmacy pickup window, and then truck circulation along the backs of the buildings that didn't interfere with automobile circulation. So, taking this Retail 101 and background and now beginning to apply it to best practices, there are all kinds of examples of where mixed use can work and does work well. But there also are a lot of examples, and I'm sure that you have all seen them, of where it does not work well. So why is that? Well, let's review about facilities for just a minute. We're talking about well-articulated retail presence, parking, visibility, access, and we're talking about adequate infrastructure. Now, let's start diving into each of those specifically. Now, I'm just going to preface the next batch of slides by saying that there are times when the best photograph was not necessarily a mixed-use project. So a lot of these photographs are for purposes of illustration. I occasionally get a comment saying, well, why did you give us a picture of that? Why did you give us a picture of a shopping center when we're talking about mixed use? And the answer is to illustrate the point. So here you have Main Street Retail in Kitsilano in Vancouver, Canada. And you can see a little bit of retail off to the mixed use off to the right side. But each of these storefronts is well articulated and has appropriate massing, signage to storefront windows, to awnings or lighting or other attributes. And so entrances, signage, transparency, lighting, awnings, finishes, they've all had good attention paid to them. And this has created some authenticity as opposed to something that is more manufactured. When we're building mixed-use projects, often they have a manufactured quality to them. So thinking about how facades are designed and how you can get some authenticity, how you can perhaps engineer in some organicness is important to the design process. Similarly, having adequate sidewalks are extremely important. And when I say adequate, I mean wide enough sidewalks. It's important, of course, to be able to walk around, but by the same token, it's also important for other things to be able to happen on the sidewalks that activate the environment that your project's in. You can see these knee walls surrounding this building. Well, those are places where people will just, sit down and have a chat or take a rest during their shopping. And, music can pop up. You've got retailers that are able to spill out onto the street with some tables and chairs and awnings or perhaps displays. And so sidewalk width becomes very important in these particular, in the design of mixed use. It's also important because space that you're devoting to a sidewalk is space that you're not devoting to leasable space. However, if you've got a dynamic ground floor, it's going to end up raising the value for what's above it because it ends up being a more compelling environment. You know, it's much different to say, hey, you know, I live in the Whole Foods building than to say, you know, hey, I live in the Dollar General building. And that's the kind of qualitative difference that we're talking about.